just overall that there is indeed something strange going on.
Mm-hmm.
Some of the cases I looked at were just really leave you wondering, especially the ones with the medical reports, where people got hurt and injured by UFO encounters during UFO encounters, and actually ended up in hospital. And with doctors, unfortunately, this is something the investigators missed. I was unable to find any medical reports.
Well, the term flying saucers is in use much these days. UFOs and more recently UAPs have replaced it when talking about unidentifiable craft flying in our skies. Author and researcher Charles Lear recently released a book called The Flying Saucer Investigators, covering the so-called golden age of the flying saucer between 1947 and 1970. Was it a golden age? Charles about to join us to talk about the book. Hi, Charles.
Hi, Dean. How are you?
I'm well. First question, why did you decide to cover this period and why the investigators?
After reading John Keel's The Mothman Prophecies, as I was reading it, I noticed there were all these interesting characters he mentioned, Gray Bar, Jim Moseley. And I was really curious as to who they might be. And I started looking into them, and they were indeed interesting. And I write a weekly blog for and so I started writing about them in the blog as well. Eventually, Martin said, "Hey, Charles, you've been writing for me for about 4 years. You've got a whole lot of material. You ought to put it together into some sort of book." And then the idea of writing about the investigators came to mind, and he put me in touch with Philip Mantle over at Flying Disc Press. I pitched the idea to Philip. He liked it, and we were off to the races. And what surprises me is that it doesn't seem anybody else has done this. They've written about individual investigators, such as J. Allen Hynek and James McDonald, and but nobody's really covered all of them. And also the period between 1947 and 1969, the Kenneth Arnold sighting up to the termination of Project Blue Book. That's actually my favorite period of saucer history. There was an earnestness that permeated most of the investigators, and there was the idea that the solution was right around the corner, and so it made it kind of a magical age for me. And it's before the field got as convoluted as it's since become.
Yeah. I'd have to agree with you as far as a mystical age. Growing up during the 60s and 70s, it was more of a mystery then, wasn't it? That might sound strange to say, but that was the attractive part of the UFO thing.
Yeah, absolutely. And I actually think it's still attractive. If it ever gets solved, I might lose interest, quite frankly.
Right. Well, I posed that question to some of the researchers and investigators that I've had on this program. What happens if it gets solved? Is it going to put you guys out of a job? And
exactly.
Yeah. So we call it the golden age in UFO discovery, but in some respects, it could also be described as somewhat of a dark period, considering the cover-ups that took place.
Well, like what's 47 to 69?
Yeah, 47 to 69.
Well, what cover-ups?
Well, we're talking about the starting, of course, with Roswell. Heading through the 50s. It was a time when the skeptics were out in full force. And Project Blue Book itself, I guess, it's probably lost a little bit of respect from a lot of people. With the way they attempted to, rather than prove the UFO was there, they always tried to create a scene where they could prove, no doubt, that no, it wasn't a UFO, it was something else.
Yeah, but well, with Blue Book, it depended on who was in charge, whether or not it was an earnest investigation or a public relations exercise. With Ruppelt, it was an earnest investigation. He was the first director of Project Blue Book. He resurrected it from the ashes of Project Grudge. He literally pulled files out of boxes that were tied up with pieces of string and put them into proper filing cabinets and arranged and organized it. But he only lasted a year. His term of service was up. He'd been called back to service after serving in the Korean War. And he, but after him, yeah, there were a series of people who just, the job was to explain them away and get the public off our back as quickly as possible. And not until Robert Friend in the 70s, J. Allen Hynek, the scientific consultant for the Air Force's UFO investigation for its entire existence, not one of others, but he was the main guy. He was the guy who got all the press.
Yeah.
And he was quite fond of Robert Friend and considered him to have approached the subject fairly. But in terms of cover-up, I really don't. Is there was a blow-off. Because I don't think they got any information that the public, the private investigators hadn't gotten themselves.
Right.
It's my opinion, but I personally think the government's just as clueless as the public in terms of what these things really are. So, but like I said, my opinion.
Yeah. Is there a big conclusion that you reached while doing your research and at the end of it and then putting the book out? Is there something that's kind of really stuck out in your mind about this period?
Just overall that there is indeed something strange going on. Some of the cases I looked at were just really leave you wondering, especially the ones with the medical reports where people got hurt and injured by UFO encounters during UFO encounters and actually ended up in hospital. And with doctors, unfortunately, this is something the investigators missed. I was unable to find any medical reports, proper medical reports. There are reports from doctors to the investigators saying my patient suffered this, but nothing official. And that would have been some very interesting documentation in terms of actual physical trace cases, traces being left on the poor souls who had these encounters, burns, and particularly burns. And another thing that plays throughout is Klieg conjunctivitis. Many witnesses reported Klieg conjunctivitis. It's also known as welder's burn. And John Keel pointed that out. And he also, his Mothman witnesses experienced the same thing. So that's an interesting phenomenon. But yeah, my main conclusion is that there's definitely something weird going on.
Yeah. During this 23-year period, did you isolate villains and heroes? Were there people that stood out and people that perhaps stood out for the wrong reasons?
The arch skeptics were pretty nasty. Philip Glass was particularly nasty. He went at Dr. James McDonald with both barrels and really did some damage. James McDonald was a prominent um, uh, meteorological physicist.
Mm-hmm.
And he he was one of the first prominent scientists to come forward in the press in favor of UFO research. And he was investigating the Westall case in Australia. A bunch of school children saw a UFO at recess,
Mm-hmm.
and it made the papers all over Australia. And he happened to be in Australia. He was I think he was on a government grant at the time doing some research. And Philip Klatt on the side. He interviewed people on tape, and those tapes are housed in the University of Arizona archives. And Philip Klass got wind that he was investigating, and he basically accused him of doing it on the government's dime and raised a big stink and caused all kinds of problems for McDonald. So yeah, the Klass in particular, but I don't write much about him in the book, actually.
No.
The arch skeptic at the big arch skeptic during that period was Donald Menzel.
Mm-hmm.
But you know, he was just a naysayer, but I wouldn't call him a villain as much as Klass, because Klass made personal attacks. Yeah, you know, Hector Quintanilla, director of Project Blue Book, you could say he was a bit of a villain. He pretty much ended Dale Sparr's career. Dale Sparr was a police officer. Him and his partner, along with other officers that met him on the way, chased a UFO high speeds all the way across Ohio into the state of Pennsylvania. And Quintanilla interviewed him over the phone first for 2.5 minutes, opened his interview with, tell me about this mirage you saw. And then his follow-up interview was a minute and a half. And he insisted that he called back later and talked to the chief of police, Dale Sparr's boss. And his conclusion was that their eyes had locked onto a satellite. The satellite came near Venus, and they chased Venus all the way across the state of Ohio. And he stuck to it. And actually, some local officials, I think a congressman, got wind of his explanation and wasn't willing to accept it, and raised the stink at the Pentagon. So Quintanilla, they said, you need to send somebody down to do a proper investigation. So Quintanilla went to Ohio, and I think it was Portage County, and went to Ohio, and it was Quintanilla, and he stuck to it. He did a proper interview, transcript, the whole bit, and came to the same conclusion.
Yeah.
So what happened is the other witnesses just faded into the woodwork. They weren't going to speak out anymore. Dale Sparr continued to speak out, and he lost his job. He lost his family, and it wasn't pretty. So you could say that Quintanilla was definitely a villain in that case.
Yeah, yeah. I you know, some of the battles that Philip Klass and Stanton Friedman had were just legendary, and Friedman was just, I mean, he gave as good as he got.
Yeah, Stanton could hold his own.
Yeah, and I just got the feeling that a lot of the skeptics during that period weren't genuine. I think, in my mind anyway, I think a lot of them were manufactured by the powers behind the scenes that wanted to just confuse this whole issue.
That's a possibility.
Yeah.
Yeah, they seem to have had some sort of backing, but you know, I honestly haven't seen any evidence that could support that.
Yeah. Do you think the excuse of national security was overplayed by authorities during this period? Everything seemed to be in the in the name of national security.
Yeah, well, there was the Cold War. That was
Mm-hmm.
definitely a major concern. And the other problem that a major problem is with UFO investigators, uh, the, with the private investigators, uh, was when people would come forward with leaks. So essentially, you've got people giving private citizens classified information. That's an issue.
Mm-hmm.
uh, you know, even if it is UFOs, if it's classified, you're breaking the law. So that was a major concern. And the UFO group, the private groups they never visits from FBI members, et cetera, throughout most of their history. So, um, in terms of that kind of national security, yeah, definitely. In terms of, and the whole UFO problem in general is, by its definition, unidentified flying object is a national security concern, obviously.
Mm-hmm. Yeah.
But as far as the Robertson panel, that was a scientific committee that was put together by the CIA to look at the problem. 1953, I think they came to their conclusion, or 52. I think it was 52. They came to the conclusion that unidentified flying objects they only pose a security risk in terms of the public possibly overwhelming communication channels during flaps.
Right.
The Washington merry-go-round had just recently occurred, and so yeah, the idea that the public could panic and just swamp communications channels and give the adversaries an opportunity for a covert strike, that was their definite concern. So they put that in their report. So downplaying UFO reports I was definitely in the mix, but
Mm-hmm.
it's never that they acted on that recommendation.
Yeah.
But it's common sense would say, yeah, they were definitely there was something up. And also funding for Project Blue Book was pulled shortly thereafter. Not all of it, but they were Blue Book was downsized pretty much immediately after, and it caused Ruppelt to actually try and get out of it early. He went to Colorado, and he came back. He was director for a little bit right before he left. So yeah.
Charles, do you think Hollywood had a role to play in the flying saucers topic during this period?
Oh yeah, definitely.
I mean, the 50s, I mean, the flying saucer movies in the 50s, I mean, they just exploded.
Yeah, some good, some bad.
Yeah. Do you think, I'm just trying to word this the right way, whether there was a message in what Hollywood was trying to get out? Were they on the side of seeking truth, or were they trying to trivialize the whole matter? I mean, it's some of my favorite UFO movies are from the 50s. And the Earth versus the flying saucers are probably my first impressions of UFOs, and that movie was back in 56. And growing up in the 60s, when I saw that, I mean, it just scared the crap out of me, but as a young kid, but it had a real effect, and it triggered my interest in UFOs.
And I don't think I personally think it was just about entertainment. I don't see any hidden hand behind those movies. And, there are a lot of people in terms of influencing, there are people who believe that the phenomena, if you go beyond the nuts and bolts aspect, machines being driven by aliens, and go with the idea that this is basically John Keel pioneered this idea that we're dealing with some sort of consciousness that coexists with us, and or maybe even be an extension of our consciousness. And a lot of people feel the phenomena is reflective. So, for instance, the first things seen by Kenneth Arnold were crescents, not discs. But the press started calling them discs and then flying saucers, and that's what people started seeing and reporting, discs and flying saucers. So in terms of what people see, if they're watching the movies and this thing is reflective, that could be an influence. It's kind of a roundabout way of answering your question.
Yeah.
But yeah, also influencing, the idea that these things are hostile was other than what the day the earth stood still. Even that, it's sort of hostile. If you don't do what we say, we're going to blow you up. But yeah, the idea that these things are hostile was definitely influenced. Was definitely a theme that ran throughout all those movies.
Yeah. Well, the period you cover in the book is 47 to 70, but actually it starts before this date regarding a man called Ray Palmer, and you open the book up with a chapter called What If?
Mm-hmm.
So what kind of a role did Ray Palmer play in all this?
John Keel called him the man who invented flying saucers.
Right. He was quite a remarkable man. I mean, he had, I guess you could call them disabilities, because he had an accident when he was a child, and it kind of limited his growth and his physique. But he pressed on, and eventually he was writing what he loved.
Yeah. Existed in a world where reality was flexible, especially when it suited his needs as a publisher. But before this, Palmer was an editor at Amazing Stories. And he got the Shaver mystery going, which is a very complicated story, but essentially it involves what he calls Deros, these degenerated creatures that live inside the earth who escape the surface because the sun's rays were damaging. There are machines down inside the earth that, if not properly shielded, also give out detrimental, harmful rays. So these creatures degenerated into detrimental robots, which is what DARO stands for. So Shaver had written Palmer a letter saying, before the Shaver mystery came about, saying that he had discovered an ancient alphabet called Man Tongue. And if you take the Roman alphabet and put a word, he put a word each next to each letter, like M, man, D, Darrow, etc. And if you can take any sentence, and if you put a word, the right word over each of these letters, it makes, you get a meaning out of it. Palmer's fellow editor had seen this letter and threw it in the trash, and Palmer pulled it out. And legend goes, he said, you call yourself an editor? And Palmer printed the letter and challenged his readers to try this for themselves. They did, and some found meaning. Then Shaver wrote him like a 20,000 word letter that was the basis of the Shaver mystery. It's called I have a storyline. It didn't have a proper protagonist. Palmer, as an editor, put all that in and published it as I Remember Lemuria, and he called it a racial memory. A weird way of saying that this it's a memory from a past life is essentially what he meant.
Mm-hmm.
And printed it as being possibly true. So Palmer fantastic story and saying this could possibly be true. And then what happened is other people, is his readers started writing letters saying they'd had encounters with these detrimental robots, and also pulling us up here on Earth. Now, Richard Shaver, was a symptom of paranoid schizophrenia for some people, feeling they're being controlled by mind. Look at the idea that Palmer essentially invented what I call the what if story. And what if it's true?
Yep.
And the flying saucer, as soon as Kenneth Arnold had his sighting on June 24th, 1947, Palmer was the last issue of Amazing Stories was out, and it was too late for the Arnold story. And so he didn't get to it until publishing Fate magazine. And he and Shaver both tried to tie the flying saucers to the Shaver mystery, because in the Shaver mystery, as it developed, there were some stories of these creatures flying around in underground shafts in vehicles that look like flying saucers, according to them. So, Palmer tried to own it.
Yeah. Were there some things that you uncovered in your research during this period that people may not have heard about that perhaps they should have?
That's a difficult question. I've uncovered things that constantly get repeated that seem to be wrong. Like I believe Hynek never said swamp gas; he said marsh gas instead during his press conference.
Okay.
If you look at the YouTube press conference, as it's on YouTube, so I don't know how complete that is, but he never says swamp gas; he says marsh gas. And also the story of how the word flying saucers came about. Most people say Bill Beckett, a writer for a Tacoma paper, I'm not sure which one, that he was the one who coined the phrase. He's not. He described Arnold as he said that Arnold described the movement of what he saw as if you skipped a saucer across the water. So that went from paper to paper to paper. And the first time I saw it, the word flying saucers showed up in the headline in the Chicago Sun-Times, supersonic flying saucers. So I think it was the Chicago Sun-Times that actually got that phrase going.
Okay.
Those are two minor things.
Yeah. Well, is there one story or one incident during that period that stands out above the rest? Obviously, you could say Roswell.
Roswell wasn't even looked at by when Roswell was 47. I think that was like a non-issue during that entire period. It didn't become an issue again until Stanton Friedman resurrected it in the 70s. But the story that stands out above the rest for me, I love the Mothman stuff. Um, that was quite something. I mean, the fact that along with the Mothman in Point Pleasant, West Virginia, this was 1966 until 1967, November 15th to December 15th, I believe. And turning off my phone, pardon me. Yeah. So a winged creature with glowing red eyes all over Point Pleasant, West Virginia, and the surrounding area. There was a huge flying saucer flap. There were so many saucers being seen that a woman who was wrote for the Athens Messenger, which was across the river from Point Pleasant. She had an office in Point Pleasant, and there were so many sightings. They actually set up a UFO desk just for her to be able to handle all the reports. So she wrote a regular column where the waters mingle, and all about UFOs. That was a pretty astounding period of time. The physical injury cases really stick out in my mind as well. The case named Charles was playing in his saw a black top across the street, and he moved to the left, it moved to the left, he moved to the right, it moved to the right, he moved to the left. It seemed to be mirroring his images, and he got the sense that it knew he was there. It came at him. It came at him so fast, he thought it was just going to blow right through him, and he braced himself. And then it stopped, hovered up over his head, and as his grandmother watched, this thing shot flame down.
Wow.
Set his hair on fire, and he ran flaming into the laundromat, into his grandmother's arms. A woman who was doing her laundry there, I think she was a nurse, actually helped put out the fire. His grandfather drove up and said, "Take Charles to the hospital." So this actually made the papers. Charles was in the hospital for 2 weeks, I believe, and I think he took another 4 weeks to fully recover. Said his face was so swollen that you couldn't see his nose. His ears were turned inside out, but he reported no pain. He only reported itching. And David Marler, a researcher in New Mexico, recently found Charles. He figured he was still alive. This actually happened in 1964. And a reason it kind of got overlooked, it really got overlooked, was because Socorro had just happened just before this. David Marler found him and interviewed him, and this guy Charles didn't even tell his wife the story, but he said yes, this happened, and the only permanent effects where he lost some hearing in his left ear, I think, and he had to wear glasses for the rest of his life after this, but those were the only effects. There was no scarring, nothing. So that's a really weird one. And if it was government, well, why would a government object be flying that could burn little boys be flying around the neighborhood? And if it's aliens, well, why in the world would aliens burn a little boy? One of my speculations is that a lot of these injuries seem to happen around the same time. I think around around that period in the 60s up until like into 67. And researchers are taking note of this. And my speculation is maybe whatever this phenomena is trying to communicate. And well, let's see what pain does.
Wow.
I don't, but there are a bunch of strange cases like that.
Yeah.
Another kid, David Wells, I forget where he was, but yeah, he similar. He got zapped. He saw a big glowing red object. He saw a tube come out, and this thing just shot a ray gun at him, essentially, wow. And burned his arm, caught his jacket on fire. His mother saw this, saw the object as well, the craft, whatever it was, and that made the papers as well. So yeah, those cases really stand out to me.
Yeah. Did you have a look at the mysterious death of First Secretary of Defense James Forrestal?
No, I didn't get into that. That is a strange story, but that didn't come up in my as part of my research.
Yeah. What about? I mean, there were some mysterious deaths during that period where people mysteriously died, and of course it's all speculation. Did you cover any of that at all?
Morris K. Jessup and James McDonald. Mm-hmm. Jessup was found in a hammock park in Florida, your backyard.
Yep.
And there was basically a hose going from the tailpipe into the back of his car. I think that was him. So it looked, written down as a suicide.
Mm-hmm.
So that was one. I did mention that.
Yeah.
And McDonald took his own life, shot himself in the head. But his wife, his marriage had failed, and he of the supersonic transport plane because he was arguing that it would damage the ozone. And a congressman whose state would benefit from the building of the SST basically says, "Don't you believe in little green men?" And got a lot of laughter in Congress. So yeah, he was made to look like a fool in Congress. So he wasn't doing so well at the time he took his life. So there's every reason that he would have committed suicide. I think Jessup's, I'm not positive. I think Jessup's marriage might have been on the rocks, but check that. I need to recall that.
Yep.
Any other, no other real mysterious deaths I can think of during that period, unless you can.
Well, I mean, James Forrestal for mine was huge, given the man's status and
mm-hmm.
and his so-called connection with MJ12 and there's another story in itself during that period, MJ12.
There's plenty of stuff out there to say that was basically an invention of Richard Doty, Air Force Office of Special Intelligence, during his disinformation campaign with Bill Moore. Mm-hmm. That's covered very well in Mirage Men and Greg Bishop's book, Project Beta. Yep. And Adam Gorightly wrote a book, Saucers, Spooks, and Kooks. So I personally, for me, I've put MJ12 to rest.
Yep.
So.
Okay. So comparing that period, Charles, with where we are now regarding flying saucers, I mean, how far have we come?
I think farther than a lot of people think. I'm hearing really good conversations out there. I think podcasts are where it's at in terms of getting information. There are a lot of them out there. There are a lot of good conversations. I have my favorites, and I think the discussing the patterns and seeing what just comes up time and time again. I think we've got a better understanding of the phenomena. I think we've got a better understanding of the phenomena, just in terms of looking at the patterns. But I don't think whether or not we'll ever get any sort of answer that's satisfying to everybody, I don't think, I personally don't think that's in our future.
Yeah, yeah. I wrote an article recently around the term flying saucers, and actually got some feedback from some people asking what was a flying saucer, because you mentioned that this term was it came up during this period of 47 to 70, and it was used almost exclusively. But in terms of your book being out and titled Flying Saucers, I mean, is it important to educate younger people today about, where this research all began, what UFOs or UAPs were known back then? Because it actually didn't surprise me that some people didn't know what a flying saucer was.
Oh, really? You actually got feedback. We're asking
I did.
Wow.
I'm talking about people in, when I say people, I'm talking kids, in their late teens that are just starting to follow this topic. And
yeah, even so, wow.
I mean, it's just, yeah, it doesn't surprise me, because, I mean, there's a lot of stuff that we grew up with that are now. I went into a department store a few years ago and asked one of the staff. I was looking for a particular Eagles CD. I asked him, have you got this particular CD? It's called so and so. It's by the Eagles, and his first reaction was, "Who are the Eagles?"
Right.
So,
yeah. Yeah, that happens. But the flying saucers thing does surprise me. I mean, Stan Friedman even continued using the term into the 80s during his lectures. Flying saucers are real. So yeah, that does surprise me. But I think and I think it's good for people to look at the history. I think it makes the subject more enjoyable if you know the history, and it also puts into perspective what's going on now if you look at the history. The hearings and the recent hearings in Congress, it wasn't the first rodeo for the saucers. Mm-hmm. So, yeah, and it puts it into perspective what's going on now in terms of congressional hearings, and also what to expect, which I don't think should be very much, but that's my personal opinion. And yeah, I mean, the whole UAP thing, I've been asked about that. And my response is, well, put ologist at the end of UAP and you get you apologist. So, you go. But yeah, by any other name, as they say.
Yeah. Well, the book is called The Flying Saucer Investigators. It's available at all good book outlets. I guess it's, Amazon being the prime spot.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, I think you can also get it at Flying Disc Press.
Yep.
Press.com.
With Philip Mantle.
Mm-hmm.
Are you doing a follow-up, or is there another book on the table that you're looking at putting together?
Yeah, I've started the UFO investigators. Book up until the 1989 UFO symposium, MUFON symposium in Las Vegas. Okay. So yeah, it's kind of where you followed. That's a period of time where ufology went off the rails.
Right.
And I personally don't think it's quite found its footing since. There were so much disinformation and misinformation and misguided UFO personalities running around during this period of time that what to believe and who to believe became really almost impossible. But people are starting to sort it out pretty well now.
Yeah. Yeah. Well, Charles, I really appreciate you joining us today and telling us about the book and a little bit about that period, as you mentioned, the golden period of flying saucers.
Well, thank you. It's been a real pleasure talking with you.
Okay, thank you, Charles. We'll talk with you again soon. Charles Lear joining us today.